What is the Islamo-Left?
So the Islamo-Left is a term which has been used to describe a sort of unholy marriage, a sort of marriage of convenience, an unholy alliance, I should say, between sections of the radical left and the Islamist movement. This is something which the term kind of originally comes from French discourse, but it's something which I think applies very neatly to what's going on in Britain at the moment, and I think describes how over the course of the past 30 to 40 years, you've seen an increasingly disorientated left want to kind of find other forms of revolt, and therefore allying themselves with some deeply reactionary forces in the form of Islamism. I think what we saw in the wake of October 7th, with people on the left openly celebrating in some cases the pogrom launched by Hamas, was an example that has really come home to roost in that sense.
That's interesting with the French thing. So what's this? Because I also only recently came to realize that Islamism in the political sense is a modern thing, like the last 30, 40 years. I only realized that recently. So has this come over from France then?
Well, the term itself, if you read the kind of etymologies of it, it does seem to revolve around discussions amongst intellectuals in France in terms of the Islamo-Left, the Islamo-Gauchism, if that's how you pronounce it. But at the same time, it actually draws a lot on what was going on the British left if you read a lot of this material. So one figure who comes up in discussion of the Islamo-Left is Chris Harman, who was formerly the editor of the Socialist Worker, which is the in-house publication of the Socialist Workers' Party. And he wrote a pamphlet in the 1990s called The Prophet and the Proletariat, where you really start to see the kind of intellectual trends, the malign intellectual trends we're talking about, be articulated. So he says, kind of essentially, of course they're reactionaries, of course they have all these anti-modern and deeply wrong-headed views, but at the same time, the Islamist insurgency around the world speaks to, I think the way he put it was, a kind of feeling of revolt that could be tapped for progressive purposes. And so there you see it very clearly articulated. And then you fast forward to 2008, you've got Jeremy Corbyn, the sort of standard bearer or would-be standard bearer of the Labour left, addressing a meeting in Westminster, referring to Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends, not saying these people aren't our allies, but there's something there we can cultivate, just saying they are our friends. And actually that quote, that meeting, which people often throw back at him, they often miss the worst bit of it, where he referred to the fact that the government had prescribed Hamas, an Islamist anti-Semitic terrorist organisation. The fact that they'd been prescribed as terrorist was a historic mistake, because they were an organisation that were dedicated to the welfare of the Palestinian people, political justice and social justice and peace in the region. So I think in that space between the Prophet and the Proletariat and Jeremy Corbyn and his friends, you see how deep and consummated that marriage of convenience had become by that point.
Jeremy Corbyn's a fascinating figure. For those outside of the UK who don't know, he nearly became Prime Minister. He was, we thought he was nearly going to become Prime Minister. It wasn't that near in the end. Labour leader, that's the left party of the two parties we really have. Okay, so I've got a lot of friends who were supporters of his, and one such friend had a go at me the other day because I had Joey Barton on the show, who's a soccer player, who he thinks was racist. And I thought, isn't that amazing? Because I would never say to him, you can't platform someone like Jeremy Corbyn. But Labour were, as I remember, I think, what was it? An independent, what were they? A group said that they, along with the BNP, the British National Party, were the only political parties ever to be sort of, what was it? Intrinsically racist.
I mean, this was the thing. I think this was the investigation by, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which had previously, the only other political party it had investigated for institutional racism, in effect, were the BNP, if I'm remembering that correctly. And of course, a lot has changed since then. But at the same time, I think it is fascinating the blind spot that people on the left, particularly the woke left, have where anti-Semitism is concerned. These are people who are obsessed with racism, except for the world's oldest and deepest racism in that sense. They're also obsessed with fascism. They see it absolutely everywhere. And yet when you have an anti-Semitic movement which is hell-bent on barbarism and murder and crushing all dissent in the form of something like Hamas, suddenly the F word eludes them in that situation. So it's a fascinating, I say blind spot, but I think that's a slightly weak and hedgy way to put it in many respects. I think they've what's developed is an odd amount of actual kind of fellow feeling between these two political trends, it seems like.
Is it just about that sense then you mentioned before of rebellion or rising up resistance? Is that what's attracting the left to Islamism?
I think that seems to be at the heart of it. That's certainly what, when you read these materials, you see. There's this kind of sense in which over the course of the past 3 or 4 decades, the left, as I was saying at the beginning, has become increasingly disorientated because there was this the growing distance between them and working class people who were supposed to be the kind of agents of change, the agents of revolution. There was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so there was this shopping around for a new sort of radical subject, a new radical force. Domestically, you could see that in the move away from class politics and the move towards a more sectional, divisive identity politics based on questions of race or sex or sexuality or gender. On the international sphere, you saw this desire to find and seek out and to seek some form of alliance with these organizations, which, again, whilst they might admit in a kind of bit of throat clearing that they are actually quite reactionary, particularly on questions of race, or not on race necessarily, but particularly on questions of sexuality and misogyny, certainly. But at the same time, that they were kind of involved in a kind of clash against Western imperialism, Western hegemony. This is how they saw it. And therefore, there was something there. There was something positive. There was something that could be potentially channeled. And what I think they failed to recognize is how this, first of all, was a ridiculous sort of diagnosis. These groups, there was nothing progressive about them. And they weren't so much anti-imperialist as they were kind of anti-Western and anti-Enlightenment and anti the values that the left used to claim to be in favor of. But that also, this was not going to end well. This unholy alliance was not something that was going to work out for the values that they claimed to believe in. But it's been so long, and I also think a lot of people on the left are so dug into their position of making excuses for these people, they find it very hard to crawl themselves out, as it were.
Is there a sense of white man's burden? Is there a sense of, oh, look at these savages, and don't take that out of context, people. It's not me saying savage, but look at these savages. Why should we expect them to treat gay people as equals and not throw them off buildings and things like that?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge part of it. I think there's a kind of profound bigotry of low expectations where that is concerned. I think you see that very clearly. You see that with the kind of excuses that are made. And I think you saw that really articulated to its most grotesque degree in the wake of October the 7th, the pogrom in Israel. Because you essentially had people, in a manner of speaking, saying that murdering and raping your way through a country, targeting civilians, was almost like the voice of the unheard. Like, because of the fact that Israel and Palestine has a very complicated history, because of the fact that people have been suffering under the conditions in Gaza, that they almost couldn't help it.
Yeah.
And if you're saying that about any group of people, I think you've lost the moral plot. And as you say, you're also speaking to a profound kind of racial/religious paternalism, as if they know not what they do. They're basically akin to beasts. It's never explicit, of course, but I think that's the undertone a lot of what they're saying.
Absolute madness. And the whole Israel situation as well. I mean, nobody seems to know, apart from almost certainly you and me and a few people who are sort of, Douglas Murray talks about it, but for some reason, anyone on the left who I speak to about this doesn't seem to understand that Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Like, that's what's led to this. And that, of course, Gaza shares a border with Egypt as well, who close it off completely. Yes, Israel controls the borders, but I mean, they're in an impossible situation, aren't they?
But I think, as you rightly say, the inability to even accept what's actually going on the ground and how it calls into question their own claims about this organisation. As I say, it wasn't just, particularly over the course of the past 10 years or so, it wasn't just that left-wingers were, again, sort of supporting these groups through gritted teeth. There was a kind of considerable amount of whitewashing of what organisations like Hamas were doing. Obviously, there was the Jeremy Corbyn quote we've talked about. Lindsay German, who is a leading figure in the Socialist Workers' Party, or certainly was also chair of something called the Stop the War Coalition, which is something that Jeremy Corbyn also used to chair. Back in 2006, if I remember correctly, she was addressing a conference and said that as much as I might have my disagreements with Hamas and Hezbollah, I'd rather be in their camp because democracy in the Middle East is Hamas, is Hezbollah. And given the fact that 2006 was the last time that Hamas run Gaza had an election, you see how profoundly wrong-headed that particular position was. But what I have been quite struck by is that I thought as soon as October 7th unfurled, and very early on it was obvious what was going on here, that this wasn't attacking military outposts this was targeting civilians. This was everyone from babies to grandmothers who had survived the Holocaust. This was people dancing at a music festival. And it was obvious that this was a pogrom on a huge and almost like apocalyptic scale. I genuinely thought, quite naively as it turns out, that there would be some people on the left, the more honest brokers maybe, who would be forced to reassess I often felt like almost like the Iron Dome over Israel that would shoot down Hamas's rockets most of the time was almost like useful for them because it kind of protected the Western left from the consequences of their own luxury beliefs, that as long as it was kept to something that they could kind of play down that wasn't so brutal and on such a large scale, that they could pretend that there was something potentially positive about this group, or at least something that one could make excuses for. After October 7th, that was impossible to do, but they kept doing it. I mean, they would try and change the subject, or they would engage in this grotesque sort of atrocity denial, which is something that maybe we can talk about. But yes, it's been fascinating how when their whole kind of worldview, where Israel-Palestine is concerned, certainly where Islamism is concerned, has been so brutally exposed, they have only really been able to double down. And that certainly doesn't speak well of them, but it is striking, I think.
The only people I've seen move are Jewish people I know who maybe held sympathies for sort of woke causes and things. Maybe they work in academia and publishing, those kinds of places where everyone around them is woke, so they hold these kinds of views. And suddenly they're turning around and going, "What? Wait, hang on," because I've got friends again who've got other friends they work with every day, and those colleagues are putting things on Instagram saying that October 7th was you think that's terrorism? This is what freedom fighting looks like. And it's like, what, sexually attacking random Jewish civilians, that's freedom fighting. It's an extraordinary thing. And then you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, if you're Jewish, because like a friend of mine was trying to suggest that Jews were very comfortable with that old argument, like, oh, Jews are fine, they don't count as a minority because they tend to vote Tory. So there was this idea of like, they're the only minority that vote Tory, therefore they're okay. And it fails to notice that, firstly, a lot of working class people are voting Tory these days. And secondly, a lot of Jews are moved that way by not feeling comfortable in Labour, not feeling comfortable in woke communities who they see as their biggest enemy now.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Jewish support for the Labour Party used to be huge. It wasn't that long ago. That used to be considered the sort of natural home. And even before Jeremy Corbyn, there was a sort of move away because of the sense of sensing where the wind was blowing on the Israel-Palestine question, but also the silence of the left, if not the complicity of sections of the left, in the rise of anti-Semitism, which again, I think is so striking because we do live at a time in which we talk about racism constantly, almost to the point of trivialities. Asking where someone is from becomes a media discussion that lasts days and days and days, as happened with that royal aide who was hauled over the coals for asking that question. Yeah. And yet, when it comes to anti-Semitism, something which we've had a serious problem with since before October 7th, but obviously it has exploded since then. The Community Security Trust, the Jewish charity, have said there's been a 100% increase in anti-Semitic assaults. So we're not just here talking about graffiti or people saying horrible things on the internet. We're talking about actual assaults. It's exploded since October 7th, highest rate for 40 years. But even before then, I was always really struck by the fact that you would have, for instance, I think there's a Jewish cemetery in Kent, which has been desecrated, I think, 8 times in the past 10 years. And that story never really makes it out of almost the local news or the Jewish Chronicle. So how even during this period of the Great Awakening, as it were, when we were told that this is all about justice and anti-racism and listening to the concerns of minorities and their experiences and so on, this anti-Semitism that was being kindled in our midst, as it were, was completely ignored and absented from that conversation. People were genuinely ignorant that it's even going on. And so in a sense, you can understand why people were maybe either taken aback or slightly tin-eared to what happened in the wake of October 7th, didn't understand where it had come from. But there's no excuse for dismissing it when it is presented to you, which many people seem to have done.
You know what's sad is that even as we're speaking now, there's my YouTube brain, which is one of my brains at the back of my brain, is going, this might not be good for YouTube, because I know that both sides, the left are going to be going, or the woke are going to be going, who cares? They don't deserve it. And then on the far right, you've got the Candace Owens stuff. She's been, in the Kanye West. She's just gone fully off a cliff, which is a shame because she's so good on certain other topics, Candace.